Welcome to a new episode of The Harsher Reality. And I'm absolutely thrilled to have with me today Steve Johnson, former US number one in tennis and Olympic medalist. Steve, thank you so much for taking the time.
Yeah, of course. Glad to be here.
First of all, congrats on the career, and I know you were retired early last year, and hopefully lots of exciting things going on. Probably a bit of relaxing.
Yeah, it's been a bit of both. It's definitely a different daily routine. Obviously, now that I am retired, and as an athlete, you're very selfish. Kind of you don't necessarily want to be, but you need to be to live in our world and to kind of do what you need to do to get your body to perform at the highest levels. But now I'm on my girls' schedule. I got two daughters, so kind of whenever they need, whatever they need, it's much more hands-on with them, which is just a different it's a different daily activity, but still very very busy.
Steve, I wanted to start with uh, your college tennis record, which a 72 match win streak, which is by any measure an unbelievable statistic. And the idea today was, to get into a little bit about the mental side of tennis and performance and that sort of thing. So I'm curious about how you see that streak and in your mind what you feel enabled that.
Yeah, it's definitely a different. There's a different way to look at it. I think more so than just what normal tennis is, right?
Mhm.
Having a 72 match win streak on tour or somewhere else where you're playing a draw and a new tournament each week or every 2 weeks, like a Grand Slam, something like that, is I think would be exponentially harder. But in college, it's all about how you start to frame the little things or the little victories, or one day at a time, kind of just having that mindset of kind of knocking down that next obstacle like right in front of you. And for us, I never even thought about it, to be honest, until I guess later in my junior years, which when the streak started. So once I got to 25, 30, like, oh, okay, like I haven't lost, or I guess I haven't lost this year,
Yeah.
kind of deal. And nobody really made that big of a deal of it, I guess, because we were still, in competition to win the team title, NCAA's, and then individuals after that.
Mhm.
And so maybe after my first year, I think I won, it was like 38 matches or 36, 40, something like that after my first year, or my junior year, sorry, the first year of the streak kind
Yeah.
of began. Then it became more of a story, right? Then it became,
Yeah.
is he going to lose? When's he going to lose? Who's going to do it kind of deal. And then it started to bring in, the outside pressure or outside expectation. But I was very lucky in the fact that my coaching staff and the people around me were, the exact right people I needed, especially in my life at that time.
And how
And
old were you, Steve? Just so we.
I was 21. So, I mean, for the U.S., I guess U.S. college, I was a normal, whatever normal is. I was an 18-year-old freshman,
Yeah.
19-year-old sophomore, give or take, 20-year-old, 21-year-old and 22-year-old senior. So, it was good because I had done a lot of maturing my first 2 years of how to handle pressure and expectation.
Yeah.
You know, being away from home first and foremost is always tricky. And then in college, kind of going back to my original point, I felt it was a bit easier because, we would play either 2 or 3 matches a week. So, back in the day when we were in the Pac 12 or the Pac 10, Pac 12, we would play Cal on Friday, the University of California, Berkeley on Friday, and then the University of Stanford on Saturday. And
Right.
it's like, okay, like if I can just beat Cal on Friday, we have a new tournament almost against Stanford on Saturday.
Right.
And then we fly home, and then maybe next week on a Tuesday we'll play, University of San Diego or
Yeah.
something like that. You're like, okay, like it's just one match and then a couple days off and then another, so it's just one match, one day at a time, which was very beneficial, I think, in that streak kind of getting to, the numbers that it did. Because if you had to start in a tournament, Monday every week, something new, Monday to Sunday, and then start over Monday to Sunday, I think that would be very much hard, very, very harder to accomplish. So, but I was lucky just to have, the group of people around me, my teammates, the coaches, and we didn't care. Nobody cared. We just wanted to win as a team, and that was the only thing that was important to me, really, at the time.
That's very interesting because you said, you didn't even sort of realize it or pay much attention to it. And of course, you've described that the nature of, the tournament is different to the ATP. How much did it matter from the psychological side that you just mentioned that, you wanted to win as a team? The fact that the focus was away from you as an individual, did that play a role in any way, or am I reading something that is non-existent?
No, that's a huge role. I mean, look, I've made my career out of being an individual athlete,
Yes.
Obviously in the tennis world, but at heart, I'm a team atmosphere, team sport guy. I mean, I grew up playing all team sports as a kid.
And not to forget, great doubles player.
Yeah, so like that's for me, like I loved playing doubles. So I enjoyed having the camaraderie, the teammate out there to help. When I was struggling, it was great to have a teammate out there to help. And it was, if my teammate was struggling, I felt like I had the ability to help uplift them in those tough moments to get them back to where their level was. So for me, I still consider myself a team player. That's why I loved being in college. How the scoring works. Just because I won, I was undefeated. That doesn't necessarily mean the team was going to win. And if the team lost and I won, it was still an unsuccessful day, right?
Yes.
And that's how I always looked at it. I always wanted to win the team. The individual aspect never outweighed the team aspect. I mean, I would have sacrificed team or individual success for sure to have the team success.
That's very interesting because then going from that, I suppose naturally leads on to sort of the transition to going, fully pro, if you want to call it that, or playing the other tournaments and joining the ATP. What was that like from, changing environment and going into what I imagine is potentially a completely different animal?
Yeah, it's hard. It shouldn't be. The court's the same, the balls are the same, the logistics are different, the players are different, the atmospheres are different. But all in all, the X's and O's in tennis doesn't change that much from college to the pros. Just your either expectation or your perspective on how it should go. And it took me, I want to say, a good 18 months to really find my own path on the tour after being so successful in college, because it sounds silly to say, but it took me a long time to figure out how to lose and to be successful at losing. Not saying that you want to lose and it's fun to lose.
Yes.
But I took losses very hard at the beginning of my professional career from a standpoint of I felt like I wasn't good enough. I was going to be this, great college player, and then the expectation was to be a very successful pro player, and I wasn't living up to that. So there was a lot of expectation that I put it on myself, right? Like, the people closest around me, they don't care one way or the other as long as the effort's there and that kind of stuff. But
And when
it
you
took
say
me a
people
while.
close to you, Steve, just for clarity, who does that include? Is it family and friends, or does it include the coaching team?
No, I mean, the hard expectations, I put it on myself solely, because, and luckily, my parents were extremely Um, Gosh, they were. I mean, I couldn't have asked for better parents, like in the sporting world,
Yeah.
because it was never about the wins and losses. At least it never felt that way to me. And kudos to them for having that mentality, or that that kind of mental foresight to look into the future like that. But all they wanted me to do was to get better, to enjoy playing tennis, to love the work that it takes to compete. It doesn't matter that I was a tennis player. If you're a banker, a doctor, a lawyer, whatever, like, you need to enjoy the process of what your passion is, to get to that end point. And that's something that I lost for a while, for sure, when I turned pro. And then luckily I found my rhythm and my routines, and the rest is kind of history. And there's always it's not just in sports, but in life. Life is a roller coaster. There's a lot of ups, a lot of downs, and you got to find the good when you can find the good, and figure out how to get out of the bad situations quickly, and kind of move on.
And what do you feel looking back? You said that the first 18 months on the tour were a little bit of a struggle. When you sort of look back, with the hindsight of age and wisdom and perspective and all that, what do you feel helped you to make the psychological shift? I think your phrase was, you learned how to lose, if it's possible to say.
Yeah, luckily I had, one of the early coaches that I had, he was with me for a long time, was on tour forever, a gentleman named Craig Boynton. We kind of started with a mantra or motto. Every week we either won or we learned. It wasn't winning or losing. What do we take from this week? What can we do differently if we get into the same situation of the match, mentally, emotionally, physically? How do we learn from our mistakes? How do we move on? How do we avoid from making those same mistakes over and over again? And very lucky that he was kind of helping me guide the ship on the tour level, because he was somebody very experienced in that world. And the growth that I had in those first couple of years was extremely, extremely beneficial. And without that, it definitely could have gone a different direction for sure. And, sometimes it's, you never know when you're going to, hit rock bottom as an athlete it always feels as if you're playing poorly, or it's never going to, turn around. But, having the right people by your side, helping you push through those tough moments is the most important thing that you can have.
Yeah, I mean, I just, I'm not sure if you've seen it. I just watched the Alcaraz documentary, which just dropped on Netflix. And, even someone so young who's had, four majors already, he talks about some of the struggles he has and he's had. And being a professional athlete, I can only imagine from
somebody like him. He's a victim of his own success to a certain degree.
Yes.
Everyone expects him to win every time he goes out there, and when he doesn't, it's a complete failure, and that's hard to do. And he's 21 years old. Like 20, it's insane. The types of emotional stress and that outsiders, I guess we don't see.
Yeah.
Because all we see is them winning a Grand Slam or whatever it may be, but there's a lot of negatives that go along with that, and it takes the right person. And you realize how impressive these guys are, like the Federers, Nadals, and Djokovic's of the world, to do what they did for so long and be that good and really never make a mistake.
Yeah, and with your own coach and the early years, what you're describing, and correct me if I've not understood this, it's almost kind of, forget the winning, the losing. You use the word process. It's almost like a focus on the process. What can we take? How did I, what did I actually do? Is that an accurate way of understanding the? Because I guess what you're saying is, and just mentioned Alcaraz as well, and you came from this tremendous success. I guess the difficulty is always as you said, it's not the friends and the family, and it's the self expectations, and you talked about expectations, and the pressure we put on ourselves. So I'm just kind of spitballing here, and I'm sort of trying to understand if the weight of expectations is the thing, or one of the things. I'm sure
For
there are other
sure.
things we come on to them. How do we sort of take our mind away from that? And it sounds to me, correct me, that the process of what am I doing, day to day in a match, rather than the ultimate outcome, sounds like was quite important from what you're saying.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's hard because as athletes, your expectation of yourself is always going to be sky high.
Yeah.
It's even though I never, won a major, never made a quarterfinal, I didn't, I whether it's realistic or not, I always walked out there every tournament I was in expecting to be the last guy standing. Whether that was a reality or not, that's a completely different subject. But the expectation you put on yourself is tough because as an athlete, you always want to be the most successful at the highest level, you name it. And it's hard because you want to be successful, but you also don't want to let the outside influences of the media, people around you kind of get in your head either, one way or the other, because, as an athlete, you're not always going to be the greatest tennis player in the world. You're not always going to be the worst tennis player in the world. There's a lot in the middle. And how do you, find whatever that middle is and continue that level of tennis day in and day out? So it is a hard reality for sure to live in, and especially in today's world with just the media and kind of how accessible everyone is 24/7. It's really hard to get away from that. Everyone has a cell phone, so it's tricky to get away from the headlines or the news or looking things up or hearing the noise and not letting it affect you, which is really could be very detrimental to anybody. Not even an athlete.
Yeah, because people talk about the mental side of tennis. This phrase gets, I say people who are interested in tennis, talk about the mental side of tennis, and so tuning out the noise, just even before getting into sort of I guess there are many layers. So one of the questions I could ask you is, what is the mental side of tennis? What does that involve? And you've already mentioned, I guess, like just cutting out the noise, all the bullshit at the media and the shit they're talking is probably a huge part of it.
Yeah, no, it's boy, it's tricky. The voice from within is the most powerful voice in the world. You can kind of redirect your emotional state, mental, whatever it may be, in a lot of different ways. Whether that's, turning it around from a bad day to a good day, being positive, having that outlook, giving yourself opportunities, or, if you are struggling on a certain day, it's, you just feel like you're digging yourself into a deeper hole with either the self-talk, positive or negative, dealing with that. And it's an interesting dynamic because there's days that I've played really good tennis, but my attitude has been very poor. So I feel like, the day has been a waste, to a certain degree. And then there's days where my attitude's a 10 out of 10, but my tennis is a 2 out of 10. And I'm like, wow, like that was a great day. Like I really felt like I got better and you're just like, objectively, when you take a ginormous step back which I've done a lot, and you watch the matches or you watch something and you're like, my coaches or my team will cut up, a set from one match and a set from another where I feel like I did, one horrible, one great. And I'll be like, oh yeah, that's the day I was playing great. And they're like, no, like that's the day you were playing poorly. Like it's because your mental state that day was positive. So you take a look at that, in this big view, and you if you miss one, we used to do drills all the time where it's like, okay, you got to make, there's 10 balls,
Yeah.
just for an example. And it's like, all right, there's some days I would make 6 out of 10 and I couldn't be happier because I hit them really good and whatever. And then the next day I will make 9 out of 10 and I'll be so annoyed that I missed one.
Yeah.
Like that I think that day was worse. So it's just finding that mental trick, which is the hardest part of any athlete, because you deal with failure on tennis on not even a daily basis, a minute by minute basis. Yeah. It's a game of errors.
It's a brutal sport.
Yes.
It's a beautiful sport.
If you're not ready for that type of, that type of loss, point in and point out. I mean, the most important thing I can say to that would be, listen to Roger Federer's, I believe his Hall of Fame speech, where he talks about, he goes, he is arguably the greatest player of all time, at least one of. He won 54% of his points over his career.
Yeah.
Like, in your mind, you would assume it would be, 70 or 80%, right? Because he just never lost. But he won 54%. So he's winning just over half over his career, and he's one of the best of all time, which is something that, I try to share to, kids, juniors, whoever, because that is a powerful, powerful lesson, because it's, you don't just go out and win 100% of the points and you walk off the court. That's just not how it works.
Yeah, absolutely. And then the days, Steve, where you felt you played, where you, let's say you won more points than you expected, but where you felt your attitude wasn't there, what is it that allowed you to know? So what is the awareness within you that, or how do you know that your attitude wasn't right?
Yeah, I mean, you can tell right away. I feel like, either before the match, during the day, there's some, some pent up, emotion, some tension, some, in the warm up, you can kind of feel it that you're like a little bit on edge. And, those days are much harder to, after the match to kind of process. It just takes a little bit longer. When, at least for me, if I had a bad attitude, those were dinners after a match that were not that enjoyable, because you let yourself down.
Yeah.
I am going to lose almost every week. Like, I know that is the case, but there's losses that, maybe I didn't play my best tennis, but my attitude and my effort was an A+. Okay, I can live with that. I just played poorly today. I played great. My attitude was great. My game plan was terrible. Okay, like how do we go about that the next time we play him? I can live with that. The ones that I lost sleep over, or dinner was no fun, or something like that, where the rest of the day was trouble, was when my attitude and my effort were not what I felt were up to my standards. And I tried to minimize those days as much as possible. And I got a lot better at that as my career went on. Because those are the hard ones to deal with. Everything else you can live with. If you play poorly, that happens. Like, there's nothing you can do some days where you just feel like you have 2 left feet out there and nothing seems to work.
Yeah.
But as long as the effort and the attitude and the willingness to change, to go out of your comfort zone, to try and win in a different way, that's the most important. That was always the most important for me.
I guess in sports they use a phrase, in the zone, generally speaking, which I would imagine is the same as kind of a state of flow, or being in flow, whatever we want to call it. From your perspective, what does that actually look like and involve on the court?
Yeah, a lot of people prepare differently. That's the one thing in our world. We have hundreds of players, men, women, you name it. Everybody prepares for their match differently to whatever they feel like gets them into that place of, peace, calm, to get ready to go compete, whatever it may be. For me, if I walked onto the court kind of in a lack of a better term, in a bit of a joking mood,
Right.
that was where I felt like I played my best, where I wasn't so uptight about worrying about the end result, at the end of the match before it's even begun. I was somebody that liked to kind of joke around with my team, my coaches, the other guys in the locker room. I mean, pretty much up until, I want to say, 10 or 15 minutes before the match.
Yeah.
And then it was like, okay, like time to warm up, time to get going. Let's do all the, and obviously I had a routine of what I needed to do before the match, but
Yes.
for me it was just to kind of keep it as light as possible. Don't, worrying about the match that was going to take place in 3 hours only
Yes.
hurt me mentally,
Yes.
because I was then going to kind of stress and focus on what could happen, what could go wrong, what could go right, and get these preconceived notions of what the day was going to look like before I even got out there.
Yes.
And that was something that didn't work for me. I was somebody that wanted to have a good time, have a laugh, and then it was like, okay, we flip the coin, I go hit a few balls, in the warm-up, right? You hit a couple serves, and then it's like, I usually took a moment before the match started, and it's like, then it's like, all right, we're ready. I know, I've gone over the game plan with my coach, you name it. It's go time. Let's do it. And whatever I have today is what I have. Whatever bag of tricks that I have with me today is what I've got. And if I'm missing a forehand or I'm missing my serve today, whatever, like, how do I get through that? And that's just, it was all mental. And when I walked out there in that frame of mind, I felt like I played my best tennis because I wasn't worried about the outcome. I was more worried about what's in front of me, the next point, the next game, whatever it is, whatever little victories I could get along the way was the most important thing for me to get into that kind of zone of when I was not even necessarily playing my best tennis, but when I was at my best, all around, like all encompassing, emotional, mental, physical, in that regard.
Because what you're talking about is really a kind of maintaining a present moment focus. The pre-match is a bit of a tricky one because there's sort of nothing to focus on in terms of you're not playing the game. But what you're describing is preventing sort of tightening up by anticipating and worrying about unnecessarily the future. We don't know what it's going to be. So pre-match, you're talking about sort of not, if I understand you, not letting the mind wander unnecessarily, which just lead to tightening up. So preventing pre-match anxiety. And then in match, what you're talking about is really playing every point, which is very now, right? It's like,
correct. Yeah, it's, I want my mind to wander aimlessly, before the match on everything except for the match,
Yes.
So whatever that is, if there's, we would talk sports, we would talk whatever, like anybody else would do, to kind of get away from that or play cards or something. But in the moment, in the match, it's always, what's the next point? Okay, if I'm serving, how do I want this point to look? I'm going to serve here, first ball here. Okay, we're going to move on. Okay, good point. What strategy's working? What do I need to do differently? That's the kind of things that I want to focus on in the match. And, it's hard not to do, but it was very important to me to not focus on the end result. If you start winning a match, it's like, okay, like if I win this match, I'm going to play this guy next round. And then, I could beat this guy, and then play the next guy, right? So it's just, finding yourself, you and me, you're across the court from me. How do I beat you? I will worry about everything else afterwards. But I need to, win this point, hold my serve, win this tiebreaker, whatever situation is in front of me. That's what I needed to focus on to to play my best, to do my best work out there.
Yeah, and tennis is an interesting sort of sport because there are gaps. There are a lot of gaps. I mean, there's a changeover, but then, between points, you're wondering, even during serve, there are gaps. And, some people joke saying golf is the hardest sport because you've got so much time. I don't play golf, but no, am I very interested in it. But I appreciate this particular psychological aspect of golf, which is quite interesting. And tennis has a huge element of that. And so I suppose um, it is quite, it must be quite easy to lose focus just seeing the number of rackets that are smashed.
Yeah, yeah. No,
Generally,
it's very easy. It's one of the hardest things because I think I feel like the hardest part of that is you start looking 2 or 3 steps ahead instead of focusing on what's at hand. And I'm very guilty of this. It's like, okay, you win a first set, you have a couple break points early in the second set. Let's call it, 1-all. And you're like, okay, like if I just break here, I can serve it out 4 times and I'm done. Right?
yeah,
Like
yeah.
the match is over. And it's like,
Yeah.
no. Focus on the break here. Okay, go sit on your changeover up a set in 2-1. How do I execute at 2-1 love all? Okay, how do I execute at 2-1 15 love, 2-1 30 love? Like, how do I execute in these moments? And that's something that is a skill that needs to be learned and practiced, and just like a forehand or a backhand or anything, because you start thinking about winning the match that early, that's when things can kind of go south because things start to spin quickly and you're not focused on how did you get to this point? All you're worried about is the finish line, and you're no
Yes.
longer running the race.
Yes. The present moment focus is a very um, is a very so I was going to say is very interesting. I mean, it is interesting, but there seem to be two aspects to this. So there's the actual hitting the ball, right? You know, whether you take it down the line and keep it in or whatever, you just being aware of time and space. Like there's this thing, and create room with your feet, whatever. I mean, a lot of it is probably second nature at that level. But there's also what you're saying is there's what is required tactically at any given point, which will of course change. Is that right? So
Yeah.
am I
No, no.
getting it?
Yeah. I mean, you will see this so often in tennis. Let's say, again, very guilty of this myself. You serve 5 incredible games in a set,
Yeah.
or 4 incredible games, and you get a break of serve. So let's say you're serving at 5-4, 5-3, whatever,
Yeah.
and you've had no issues all day, and then you go to serve out a match, and you play the worst 4 points possible
Yeah.
because you are worried about winning.
Sure.
You're worried about what's going to come next. You're not focused on how you got there. Whether that was good first serves, high first serve percentage, playing a certain strategy, the X's and O's. And it's funny because, I'll do some commentating now and you watch it and it's like, it's painful to watch sometimes because you know how badly they want to win, but they're mentally trying to get to the finish line rather than, putting their right foot in front of their left and just continuing to run that race to get to that point. And they change their tactics, and you can see it as a bit of a panic rather than what they've done the last 90 minutes or 2 hours to get to a point to win the match.
Yeah. So when one falls out of the zone or starts worrying about the future, how do we refocus? Or I could ask it differently. Did you have particular? Because I suppose just I guess there are two layers. There's just simply being aware that I'm doing it, meaning that I am lost in this, I'm anticipating, or I'm not in the moment. So, and I can imagine that, because there are a lot of talented players that no one knows what's going on in their brains, right? I can imagine that even the pros in the top 100 who we see on TV mostly, I can imagine that some of them, some of the time, or most of the time, may not even be aware that they're doing it because they're caught up in the process. And then the second part of the question is, okay, once you realize that, then what happens? How does one recover?
Yeah, that's I think that quality is, I mean, it's not the most important, right? Being able to play tennis is the most important. But outside of that, when you get to this level,
yeah,
the guys that are the most successful are the ones that get off of bad moments quicker. If you get broken on serving for the match, the Federers, Nadals, Djokovic's, they don't collapse, right? They go out and they just break serve again the next game, right? Like that's what they do. They don't worry about failure. They move on. They know that their tennis is good enough. And that is a very powerful tool to have. And guys don't do it that well. And that's what separates the phenomenal to the really good to just good and kind of so on and so forth, is dealing with that type of failure. Failure, right? Like
setbacks, failure, whatever you want to call it.
Yeah, a bit of a setback, right? And getting off of those tough moments, because that's what separates the really good players from the great players.
And you talked about, you said being able to play tennis, it's very difficult for sort of lay people. I play a bit of tennis, but it's a joke, right? Compared to the top or whatever, even a county player or someone who's won like a regional tournament, in a village in England somewhere. The level is insane, unimaginable. So when we think about sort of this idea of playing tennis well, obviously the physique comes into it a little bit, obviously some talent, whatever we call it, and then there's the mental side of it. So how do you see this kind of constellation of what's important? Because you said, at that level, being able to recover from these setbacks or failures is probably what separates, the very best players. So is that something you think that becomes more important simply because the pressure is so high that it's important then, whereas if you're playing it at a different level, more not recreational, but not the ATP, it would be. I mean, how do you see this sort of talent, physicality, hitting the ball well, psychology? What is the mix? How do you kind of conceptualize it?
Yeah, I think that's like I want to say that's one of the most important pieces to separating guys' success levels on tour, especially, is getting off of tough moments, not letting it bleed into 2 weeks, 3 weeks, a month, multiple matches. Because, there is a lot of scar tissue in tennis. You lose every week. You try not to. You don't want to lose every week, but it's just the way the world works. And at our level, the tennis is pretty similar. The levels are going to be very similar. It's going to be
fine margin.
Few points every match. I mean, I bet I could go through dozens and hundreds of matches, and if I can change 1 or 2 points, like I feel like I will. I could. My whole life could be in a different trajectory, and that's how small the margins are in our world, and it's just so hard because that is a tough skill to learn, and you do not learn that skill until you are in that moment.
Yeah.
And when you're in that moment and you're faced with that adversity of, okay, how do I get myself off the floor here and continue on in this match because I was winning and now, I've lost serve and what have you. Those are the moments that really test your character and your ability as a competitor to go out there and can compete to the best of your abilities, even when it is not going well. Because we can all win. Everybody can win. You know, I say this all the time. Anybody can win when they're playing well. That's easy. If you know, if I play my best tennis and I win, that's not hard. Because, you know, everything worked today. Like, life was easy. You know, it's the matches that you don't play well or things don't go your way and you win that really stand out and what sets players apart from one another.
And now, having retired, Steve, when you look back at, you know, kind of your tennis career, and now that you're a civilian,
that's a very accurate terminology.
What would you say, if it's possible to say, that, you know, you take away from tennis that you find yourself, you know, applying to life? I don't want to call them lessons. That's too, you know, naff. But learnings or just a way of being or whatever that you discovered through being a pro and, you know, going through this incredibly tough journey.
Yeah, I mean, the silly answer is I'm really good at traveling the world. You could drop me anywhere in the world and I could find my way out of it, no problem. I can get back home.
So you're doing all the family, planning all the family.
Yeah,
holidays.
I will tell my wife, like, if we're flying somewhere, like, I'm very good at this. I know the routes, I know the planes, I could tell you everything about the airports, you name it. But ultimately, what I try and transfer over to my life is my willingness to learn. You know, if it's something new, right? Like, you know, parenting is new, so learning, you know, okay, what works, what doesn't work, how do I parent, you know, what do I do in certain situations. Another thing would be being very practical about my approach to life, you know, especially with kids. You know, I have two daughters, 4 and 2, and being practical at 4 and 2 are not high on their list, right? Like, they're just little crazy people to a certain extent. You know, it's not something that, you know, it's not always a straight line with them. And so just learning that and then being just prepared. You know, in tennis, I was very much, as much as I came off as, you know, I was trying to goof around or laugh before I walked on court and like to have some fun. I was very aware that my work and my preparation up until that point was spot on. I didn't miss a beat. So I knew when I walked out on court, the work had been done and everything was in order so I could go compete. Whatever I had that day is whatever I had. But all the preparation leading up to that point was in my power, and I was dialed in from an X's and O's standpoint. Like, everything was prepared. I had everything. I never worried about anything on court other than what do I have today? Is my forehand going to be good? Is my backhand going to be good? Is my serve going to be good? Whatever. So that's kind of the lessons that I took was, you know, each and every day I try and be the most prepared at, you know, being a regular person just at home. And that's kind of how I've led my life for the last, for as long as I can remember, and that's how I'm going to continue to do so. So those are the most important things that I learned, that I take from my tennis life to just, you know, regular everyday life.
Great lessons and great advice. One of the things you mentioned, Steve, in your one of your retirement interviews at Indian Wells, I think it was, you used this phrase. I think I wrote it down. You said, "I'm happy." You said you'd always focus on enjoying the game. And then you said this, and they didn't pick up on this, but I wanted to ask you. You said something, I think I've got this right. I felt like I didn't cheat the game of tennis. They didn't ask you about it, so I thought, you know, I would. What did you exactly mean? Because I can sort of imagine, but...
Yeah, no, I mean, not like in any other words than I felt like I left no stone unturned. You know, if I felt like there was, you know, something in my diet that was missing, even if it was wrong, I changed it. I tried everything that I could. I felt like, if there was an equipment thing I needed to change, or a new fitness, whatever, right? Like if there was something that I needed to change physically about me, or I needed to talk to a therapist or something, right? Like if there was something that I felt like I needed to do, I did it. Whether that was the right strategy or the wrong, I felt as if, like, I don't look back on my career with any regrets. I made a lot of mistakes in my career, for sure. I mean, there's no doubt about that, in travel, in tournament schedule, in training schedule, whatever. But I felt like I didn't make those mistakes year in and year out, or it was, the most, I guess what I would mean by that the most is I look back at my career and I felt like I did everything in my power to maximize my potential. And I felt like to the last match that I played at Indian Wells last year, everything I did was to be successful in my sport. And I'm very proud of that. I don't wake up or I don't look back and be like, gosh, in 2018, I wish I would have not whatever. Like, I wish I would have, whatever. I don't look back on anything like that and be like, I wish. Of course, I look back at certain matches and be like, gosh, I wish I would have executed on this better. Or, that's a different story. But I never felt like I cheated the game of my preparation, my tenacity, my heart. I mean, I felt like if anybody's ever watched me, I was a pretty easy book to read while I was out there, whether it was, good, bad, indifferent. There was a lot of emotion. Sure. So that's just kind of how I felt that. And I felt at peace, really, with that decision.
Fantastic. And the enjoyment side of things, and you've talked about this. I'm deliberately asking it this way. How difficult is it to enjoy the beautiful game that tennis is when you're competing on the tour?
It's not that hard when you're winning. It's not that hard when you're winning. I promise you. It's a lot of fun when life is going well and you're winning, and but it's the moments that it's the tough moments. It's the tough stretches of the year. It's whatever that ultimately define you as a person and your character. How you go about your business. How are you treating the people around you. And that is something that I'm very proud of. And again, I made a lot of mistakes. I've had to apologize quite a few times to coaches, to my wife, to whoever, because, I was such a downer during certain periods of my tennis career because things weren't going well and I felt like I was a failure. They didn't see me as that, but I saw myself as that when I was going through tough stretches. And, ultimately they are the people that help you climb out of that hole. They're in it with you day in and day out. And without, the right support staff and the support people around you, this game is immensely harder. In that regard. Yeah.
I mean, it's very interesting because by its very nature, all competitive sport is kind of it's about winning, right? So by the whole construct, and when you get into that, it whether you like it or not, and as you said, if you're winning all the time, but even the ones who wins, I mean, you mentioned Federer. I mean, even he's lost, right? A lot. I mean, maybe not as much as some others, but. And when you look at sort of your love for the game over the past kind of 15, 20 years. Actually, what age did you start playing, Steve?
Very young. I mean, my dad was a tennis coach, so I got into it very young. I mean, I played my first tournament when I was like 5.
Got you.
But I didn't play tennis like full on until I was probably 15, 16. Yeah. And I played other sports up until that point, and then at that age, I kind of took tennis more seriously than I did before.
And the holding on to the love, if I may phrase it that way, is that something that was, relatively easy for you? I'm sure it's different for different people. throughout the, or and as you mentioned, when the losses come, is it quite very quickly kind of covered up by
Yeah. I mean, it goes
everything
in
that's going?
waves. It goes in
Yeah,
waves for sure. I mean, my love of the game ultimately still as strong as it ever has. I love the game of tennis. You know, I, I love the fact that I can go out there and compete every day against somebody else, and you don't know what that day holds, right? So you walk out there, I could play you 10 days in a row. Every day could be different.
yeah,
You might play better one day, I might play worse, your forehand, whatever, right?
yeah.
So that's the fun part. I look at tennis as a big game of chess.
Mm.
It's you make a move, I make a move, I counter that, go back and forth. You're kind of just poking and prodding your opponent each and every day to see what their weaknesses are. How can you exploit those weaknesses? And that part of the puzzle was extremely enjoyable for me. And yes, of course, the days that you got outmaneuvered out there, some days that
Yeah,
stung and that hurt, but that's part of the game. One guy's
sure.
going to win every day and one guy's going to lose. And guess what? You're going to lace them up the next week and you're going to try again. And that's the beauty of our sport, that you're always going to get another opportunity the next week to continue to grow, to get better, to minimize those mistakes or make changes to those mistakes that you made either the week prior or
Yeah,
whatever you have.
absolutely. And the tennis calendar is insane, and there are a lot of options. Too
It's
many,
never ending.
some would say, but that's a discussion for another day. I've got a question, Steve, from you'll appreciate where this is coming from. When I mentioned to you that it's a musician who asked this, and I wanted to ask you. And the question is, to what extent is there an element of expressing yourself, or being an entertainer in tennis?
Yeah, there's a lot of that. I mean, to some degree, guys take it much more literal to be an entertainer, right? I mean, there's guys, Gael Monfils, Nick Kyrgios, Alexander Bublik, you name it. These guys are out there to, it feels like entertain. They're also incredible tennis players, but they are showmen, right? They go out there and play. I always felt somewhat like an entertainer, to the point of, we are out there playing in front of thousands of people. Like, they're there to watch you play. Like, you're not a musician, you're not at a concert, but you are
Yeah,
out there to compete and give your best effort each and every day. And again, you may not play your best tennis, but the one thing that you have in your control is your effort level and your attitude. And having those two things at the height of whatever you need to be, that is extremely important to go out there, because I think everyone respects that. You know,
yeah,
that's something I prided myself on, that I never felt like I gave up in matches.
yeah,
I might have gotten my ass kicked and the scores might be bad, but I
yeah.
felt as if I tried until the last point. Even if it wasn't going well, like, my effort level was going to be there. The score may be lopsided on that day, but I'm going to go out there and compete my hardest until the last point.
That's very interesting. And when you look at sort of, I love tennis. I would say, I mean, the scoring system is fascinating, but I like more the aesthetics of tennis. I think it's a very beautiful sport. The strokes, I love the feeling of hitting the ball. I don't hit it very well, but I like the look of it, especially Wimbledon. I love the green and the
Who
white and the.
doesn't?
That's just literally colors, but I know it sounds very childish, but I love tennis for the aesthetics of the game mainly, and the feeling of literally just hitting the ball, and how it feels. So when you look at players and sort of, some people say, Federer, it's art, and he never sort of really agreed with this, because he said various things around it. Probably it's too modest to agree anyway, even if he did believe it. So it's a bit of a weird question what I'm asking, because obviously it's not art; it's a competitive sport. We know that, but there is an element of it's not gymnastics, obviously, which is very artistic, right? I mean, it is a kind of a competitive thing, but that is bordering almost dance in
Right.
terms of expressing your whatever feelings. So I don't know if I'm making any sense here. So when you look at players and when you in your own experiences, do you think that comes into it at all? I'm not talking about sort of being kind of Nick Kyrgios,
Yeah, yeah.
being a joker, which probably is a self-defense mechanism because he can't deal with the I don't know.
No,
I'd
you're
actually talk to
pretty
him.
accurate with that one. Yeah.
Um, do you think it comes into it at all, or is it just an artifact? Some people look more graceful than others just because the way they are built or whatever.
Yeah, look, some people were just born to be certain things, and taking a look at like Federer, the way
Yeah.
he moves on the court is remarkable. What I find the most impressive, or the coolest thing that I actually watch, I feel like of all tennis, and I've seen a lot of tennis, is when they show just like the half screen of Federer, like waist down,
Yeah.
like while he's moving on the baseline, the way his footwork is, the way his feet move, the way he glides around the court, it is objectively beautiful to watch. And not, I feel like I move like that and I look like an elephant out there, right? Like, and then you watch that and you're like, oh my goodness, like that's Picasso, and I'm over here finger painting, basically is what's happening.
Now you know.
So
Now you know how we feel like
it's,
as recreational players.
but it's true though. I mean, it's like that's the crazy part is, watching him do things like that. You're like, okay, like this is another level. Like he was born to do this. The way his mechanics are, the way his body is, his timing, his just overall movement is some of the most incredible things I have seen on a tennis court.
Yeah, interesting. Steve, I don't want to take more than the hour that we agreed, but I've got a final question for you, which I probably think I know the answer to, but I should ask it. Who is the GOAT? The greatest of all time. Someone described, is it Novak Djokovic, who is undoubtedly the most successful player? I use this word very precisely.
Yes.
The most successful player, or is it someone else, the big three, or someone else from the past?
No,
Who is
look.
your GOAT? Who is your
Yeah,
GOAT?
this is this talking. It doesn't matter what you're talking about. I would assume sports, life, whatever. This will always be a heated debate on any aspect. Is
But we
who's
want
the greatest
Steve
of?
Johnson. We want Steve
It's
Johnson
Roger.
to be.
It's
Yes.
Roger for me. So I measure things a little differently. Of course, Novak will always have the records. I guess for now, I mean, all records are meant to be broken,
Yes, yes.
right? But he will have more Grand Slams. He will have more, Olympic singles medals. He'll have more Master Series. He'll have more time at number one. He'll have the head-to-head. You name it. He has all of
Yes.
that. But when you go around the world, Roger Federer is transcendent. Everybody knows who Roger Federer is, right? If you go any corner of the world and you ask, they know who Roger Federer is, and they wouldn't necessarily know who Novak is.
Yes.
And that's kind of how I, picture it. I put that that's heavily weighted in my GOAT debate metrics is worldwide, not fame, but just notoriety of what he has done for our sport over the last 25 years. He's grown it exponentially with how he's handled himself. His tennis speaks for itself. What he does outside of tennis, his philanthropic work throughout the world, his just overall growth of the game is just immeasurable.
I mean, I'm a big Federer fan, so I'm not going to be the one to disagree with you. But what's one thing I would like to ask, and I don't want to get you into trouble for asking this question, but maybe it's not so bad. If you had to speculate on the what's the right word? The psychology, the clarity of focus. We know that Novak beat Federer more, right? Or whatever. Is it possible to say, as a pro, as an observer, as a student of the game, as a master of the game, someone like yourself. When you look at the two, do you have a speculative view on the quality of mental focus, being in the zoneness of Federer versus Novak, or is that a question you say, dude, don't ask me such questions?
No, we're splitting hairs on that one. I mean, these guys are so incredibly mentally strong.
Yes.
It's insane. It's the only time you feel as if these guys crack in the slightest is if they play one another. Do you know what I mean? Like where it's like, okay, like, wow, like I haven't seen this side of Roger. I haven't seen this side of Novak ever. And that is hard to do against those guys because they're so mentally strong. They're so resilient. Their tennis is so incredible that they just, it takes a special effort to kind of get into the mental side of these guys, and it doesn't happen often.
That's it. Steve Johnson, thank you so much for taking the time. It's been a fascinating chat, and I really appreciate you joining the show.
Yeah, of course. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much.